He didn't just kill them, he arranged them like a death-dealing artist. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where bedtime stories wear hoods and carry blades. If this quietly cursed little channel helps you rest and brings even a little calm to your busy life, then our efforts are worth every second it takes to make these daily videos. So please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you over there. Your support goes a long way, and our appreciation for that is more than you could know. Tonight we walk carefully into the woods, not to steal from the rich, but to ask something no one dares out loud. Was Robin Hood a folk hero, or a forest-dwelling psychopathic serial killer? The answer is not as straightforward as it may seem. Close your eyes. The room is still. The fire crackles softly. You're warm beneath the covers, and the silence feels like it's waiting, not watching, just remembering. Your breath slows. Your body sinks. And now the forest rises. Torchlight flickers on wet bark. The air smells of damp wool and ash. Somewhere nearby, something is hanging from a tree, or used to be. There's blood in the moss, and boot prints in circles. Every path is his, and no one alive ever saw him leave. Sleep well. The woods are quiet now. Evidence drawn from medieval court records, coroners' reports, and parish documents paints a very different picture of the Sherwood Forest outlaw. What emerges from these sources isn't a champion of the poor, but rather a textbook example of an organized serial killer operating with impunity in 12th century England. The methodology involves cross-referencing multiple primary sources, comparing dates, locations, and victim profiles. Modern forensic psychology principles have been applied to medieval crime scenes. Centuries of romantic revisionism have been stripped away to examine only what the contemporary evidence actually shows. The results are profoundly disturbing. But then again, the best bedtime stories always are. The Index case, the first murder that establishes the killer's signature, appears in Nottingham's coroner rolls from autumn of the year in question. The victim was a sheriff's guard named William of Locksley. The details matter here, so a systematic examination is required. The body was discovered in a seated position, which immediately reveals something important about the crime. Corpses don't arrange themselves. The muscle relaxation that follows death, known as primary flaccidity, would have caused a naturally deceased person to slump. But William of Locksley was positioned with his back straight against the tree, legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded in his lap. This required physical manipulation post-mortem. Someone spent considerable time with this corpse. The decapitation itself presents the first major piece of evidence. The coroner's report, written in Latin but quite clear in its descriptions, notes, "Unum ictum," one stroke. Medieval executioners, even skilled ones, rarely achieved clean decapitation in a single blow. The neck contains vertebrae, cartilage, and tough muscle tissue. Yet this cut was so clean that the examining physician noted the edges of tissue appeared velut forfis sectum, as if cut with shears. This suggests either exceptional strength combined with an exceptionally sharp weapon, or more likely that the victim was positioned precisely to facilitate the cut. The angle would have been calculated. The victim likely drugged or otherwise incapacitated to prevent movement. This wasn't a battlefield killing, or even an execution. This was surgery. The behavioral analysis perspective reveals something even more disturbing. The killer didn't just take the head, he destroyed the victim's facial features first. The report describes systematic mutilation: eyes removed, nose carved away in strips, lips peeled back, teeth individually extracted and arranged beside the body. This isn't rage. Rage is messy, impulsive, exhausting. This is methodical deconstruction. Each step would have taken time, patience, and a complete lack of emotional response to the victim's humanity. The evidence points to someone who sees faces not as identity markers, but as puzzles to be disassembled. The placement of the body against an oak tree wasn't random either. Oaks feature prominently in Robin Hood mythology. Robin of the Oak Lord of Sherwood. The killer was already creating his legend, using symbolism that would resonate with local folklore. This wasn't just killing, this was composing narratives. The victim selection proves equally telling. William of Locksley wasn't a tax collector or known oppressor. Court records show he was a middle-ranking guard with no particular history of corruption or cruelty. His selection suggests the killer wasn't motivated by specific grievances, but by opportunity and symbolic value. The sheriff's livery made him a suitable prop for the performance. Forensic psychology indicates that killers who take trophies, and the missing head clearly represents a trophy, don't start with decapitation. Trophy taking is learned behavior that escalates over time. This level of confidence in the first documented killing suggests either previous undiscovered victims or someone who had extensively fantasized and planned before acting. The post-mortem treatment of the body reveals crucial information. Despite the violence of the death and mutilation, the corpse was cleaned. The clothes were arranged. The positioning was exact. This indicates someone who cares about presentation, about how their work will be received. An audience was anticipated. The extraction of teeth proves particularly significant. In medieval times, teeth were sometimes kept as remembrances of the dead, but extracting them from a living or recently deceased person requires specific tools and knowledge. The coroner notes they were removed integre, intact, roots and all. This wasn't someone yanking teeth with pliers. This was someone with dental knowledge, possibly medical training. The arrangement of the teeth beside the body in a specific pattern, the report mentions they formed a crescent shape, suggests ritualistic behavior. Serial killers often develop personal rituals that have meaning only to them. These rituals become compulsions, necessary components of the killing act that provide psychological satisfaction. The crescent pattern appears again in later crimes, becoming part of the signature. The fact that valuable items were left on the body eliminates robbery as a motive. William of Locksley's purse contained a week's wages. His sword remained in its scabbard. His boots, expensive leather that would have fetched good money, were not only left, but cleaned and polished post-mortem. This crucial detail narrows the psychological profile significantly. The killer wasn't motivated by material gain. Something else entirely drove these actions. The timing of the discovery provides additional insights. The body was found by a charcoal burner at dawn, but forensic details in the coroner's report suggest William had been dead for approximately 18 hours. This means the killing likely occurred in broad daylight, possibly late afternoon. The killer was confident enough to murder, mutilate, and carefully arrange a body during hours when the forest would have had other traffic. This speaks to intimate knowledge of patrol patterns, forest paths, and local movements. The killer knew exactly when and where he could work undisturbed. Evidence of planning emerges from multiple details. The coroner notes ligature marks on the victim's wrists and ankles, but no bonds were found at the scene. The killer brought restraints and took them away afterward. This indicates preparation for capture, control, and extended interaction with the victim. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated event. Additional evidence of premeditation comes from the preservation state of certain elements. The extracted teeth showed signs of having been treated with some kind of preservative. The coroner notes they remained incorruptus despite exposure. The killer had brought materials to preserve his trophies, suggesting this was always intended as a collecting expedition, not merely a murder. The head was never found, despite extensive searches involving dozens of men over several weeks. Dogs brought to track the scent lost it at a stream approximately 200 yards from the murder site. This creates the first concrete link to trophy collection. Serial killers who take body parts typically have prepared storage locations. The fact that no trace of the head was ever discovered suggests sophisticated preservation methods and secure storage. This wasn't someone who simply killed and discarded. This was someone building a collection. Parish records from surrounding villages reveal an interesting pattern in the weeks before William of Locksley's murder. Reports surface of a hooded figure observing guard posts, asking questions about patrol schedules, showing particular interest in individual guards' routines. The descriptions vary significantly. Sometimes tall, sometimes shorter, different coloured beards, different accents. But the behaviour remains consistent. Systematic intelligence gathering disguised as casual conversation. One innkeeper in Edwinstowe reported a travelling merchant who spent 3 evenings asking detailed questions about the sheriff's men. Which guards were harsh with common folk? Which ones looked the other way when poor families poached the king's deer? Which ones had families versus which lived alone? The merchant's appearance changed slightly each evening, different clothes, different way of speaking, but the innkeeper noticed the same distinctive way of holding his cup, the same pattern of tapping his fingers when thinking. This pre-offense behavior represents what criminologists call hunting. The killer was selecting victims, studying their patterns, learning their vulnerabilities. William of Locksley wasn't randomly chosen. He was researched, evaluated, and ultimately selected for specific reasons. Perhaps his route took him past the perfect killing ground. Perhaps his schedule provided the ideal window of opportunity. Perhaps something about his appearance or behavior triggered the killer's interest. The clinical precision of the murder reveals important information about the killer's emotional state. This level of control, especially in a first documented killing, suggests someone with an unusual ability to compartmentalize. Most killers show signs of stress, excitement, or rage in their early crimes. The crime scenes are messy, disorganized, showing evidence of the internal chaos driving the violence. But William of Locksley's murder scene was orderly to the point of artistry. Every cut deliberate, every arrangement purposeful, every detail considered. This indicates someone who finds peace in violence, who achieves calm through killing. The symbolism of the oak tree placement becomes even more significant when considered in the context of medieval folklore. Oaks were considered sacred, protective trees. To place a mutilated body against an oak was to pervert that protection, to turn a symbol of safety into one of threat. This shows sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. The killer wasn't just removing an enemy, he was contaminating a symbol, ensuring that every oak tree in Sherwood would thereafter carry an echo of threat. Further analysis of the crime scene reveals microscopic details that escaped contemporary notice but proved significant. The coroner mentioned in passing that the ground around the body had been swept clean of leaves in a perfect circle approximately 3 feet in diameter. This wasn't casual clearing, this was measurement, precision, the creation of a stage for the body. The killer had brought tools to prepare his crime scene, possibly including measuring implements, to ensure geometric perfection. The teeth arrangement deserves deeper analysis. Beyond the crescent pattern, the teeth were sorted by type, incisors together, canines flanking them, molars arranged by size. This level of organization during or immediately after a murder suggests someone who finds ordering and categorizing soothing. The killer was self-regulating through ritualistic behavior, using the arrangement of trophies to maintain psychological equilibrium. Weather records from the period indicate it had rained heavily 2 days before the murder, leaving the forest floor soft and impressionable. Yet investigators found no footprints leading to or from the scene, except those of the victim and the charcoal burner who discovered the body. Either the killer possessed preternatural ability to move without leaving traces, or more likely, he had carefully obscured his tracks using techniques that wouldn't be formally documented until centuries later. This suggests military training or extensive wilderness experience. The selection of William of Locksley becomes more significant when his personal history is examined. Court records show he had recently testified in a poaching trial, showing leniency toward the accused. He was known to frequent a particular tavern where he spoke freely about patrol routes after several ales. He had a distinctive scar on his chin from a childhood accident. All of these details would have made him an ideal first victim. Predictable movements, accessible information, and a unique physical identifier that the killer could have been collecting information about. The coroner's addendum, added 3 days after the initial report, notes something curious. When the body was moved for burial, investigators discovered that the ground beneath had been treated with lime. This would have accelerated decomposition of any biological evidence, while preserving the body above through different chemical treatments. The killer understood evidence destruction at a level that wouldn't be common knowledge for centuries. 3 days after the Locksley murder comes the Nottingham Gate incident. Multiple witness testimonies corroborate the basic facts, though they differ in details in ways that actually strengthen their credibility. Real witnesses always see things slightly differently. When testimonies match perfectly, that suggests coaching. A man approached the gates, carrying what appeared to be Robin Hood's head. The psychological implications are staggering. The killer has just committed an elaborate murder, taken the head as a trophy, and within 72 hours approaches authority figures with a decoy head. This isn't panic or attempts to deflect suspicion. This is entertainment. This is play. The witnesses describe the stranger's height consistently, 6 feet and 1 inch, matching Robin Hood's description. They note his educated speech, his knowledge of guard protocols, his ability to identify the senior officer without asking. These aren't the observations of a frightened populace seeing phantoms. These are specific details that suggest someone with inside knowledge, someone who had studied targets extensively. The stranger's approach was timed perfectly for the changing of the guard, that liminal moment when attention is divided and protocols are in flux. This isn't coincidence. This is intelligence gathering put into practice. The killer knew not just the guard schedules, but the human dynamics of shift changes, the moment when vigilance naturally drops. The performance itself deserves detailed analysis. The stranger didn't simply present the head, he created a theatrical moment. Witnesses describe how he paused at just the right distance to be seen but not immediately approached, how he slowly unwrapped his bundle to build anticipation, how he held the head at the perfect angle to catch the dying light. This was stagecraft, pure and simple. The head itself represents extraordinary planning. Creating a convincing decoy that could pass initial inspection required materials, tools, and skill. The witnesses described the beard as perfectly groomed, the scar as exactly as the posters show. This wasn't a hastily crafted prop, but a carefully prepared piece of theatre, possibly created well in advance for exactly this purpose. The disappearance from a crowded area speaks to advanced planning. Creating confusion in crowds is a learned skill that pickpockets train for years to achieve. The killer managed to vanish while carrying a supposed human head, suggesting prepared escape routes, possibly accomplices, and definitely prior practice. But analysis of witness statements reveals something more. At least 3 different witnesses describe seeing the stranger leave through different exits simultaneously. This wasn't just vanishing. This was misdirection on a massive scale. The murder of Geoffrey of Trent, the guard captain who accepted the false head, opens entirely new dimensions of analysis. Found dead in his quarters, with his facial skin surgically removed, door barred from the inside. The impossibility of the locked room scenario has puzzled investigators for centuries, but modern analysis suggests several possibilities. Either the killer was already inside when Geoffrey barred the door, suggesting hours of patient waiting, or he entered through another route. The room was on the 2nd floor with 1 window. No signs of forced entry. This points to someone with either exceptional climbing skills or, more disturbingly, a key. But there's a third possibility that medieval investigators couldn't have considered. The killer was already in the room, because he was wearing the face of someone Geoffrey expected to see. The facial removal represents the first concrete evidence of the killer's specific pathology. The precision of the removal, the skin taken in one piece, muscles left intact, no damage to underlying bone, suggests extensive practice. This wasn't a first attempt at facial removal. The technique required would have taken multiple attempts to perfect. The speed is also significant. Geoffrey was seen entering his quarters at sunset and found dead at dawn. The killer had at most 10 hours to enter, kill, perform precise surgery and exit without detection. This suggests either remarkable efficiency or prior preparation that reduced the actual work time. Geoffrey's half-finished report provides crucial psychological insight. He was here, in the room with me. I'd barred the door, but he was already inside. This suggests the killer had been hiding in the room before Geoffrey arrived, possibly for hours. The patience required for this kind of ambush predation exceeds normal human parameters. Most killers strike quickly, driven by impulse or opportunity. This one waits, watches, chooses moments with tactical precision. The statement, "He says I looked too closely," reveals the killer's motivation structure. This wasn't random selection. Geoffrey was chosen because he had noticed something, had perhaps begun to piece together information that threatened the killer's operations. The murder was both punishment and prevention, eliminating a threat while sending a message to others who might look too closely. The phrase, "He says I saw what I shouldn't have seen," suggests extended conversation between killer and victim. This wasn't silent execution, but performance, dialogue, interaction. The killer wanted Jeffrey to understand why he was dying, needed his victim to acknowledge the transgression that had sealed his fate. This need to be understood, to have motivations acknowledged, represents a sophisticated form of narcissism. The killer wasn't just eliminating threats, he was teaching lessons, correcting behavior, imposing his own moral structure on the world. The discovery of the leather masks in Jeffrey's effects opens an entirely new dimension to the analysis. The widow's description, soft, supple, disturbingly realistic, combined with the chemical analysis suggesting advanced tanning techniques, points to someone creating wearable faces. This goes beyond costume crafting into something far more disturbing. The tanning process for human skin differs significantly from animal hide preparation. The pH balance is different. The protein structures require different treatments. The preservation of fine details like pores and hair follicles demands specialized knowledge. The killer had either developed these techniques through experimentation or had access to knowledge that shouldn't have existed in medieval England. Historical research reveals that certain Arabic medical texts from the 9th century contain detailed information about skin preservation for surgical training. These texts were supposedly limited to major medical centers in Cordoba and Cairo. Their presence in 12th century England would suggest either exceptional travels or access to restricted knowledge. The 3 masks found represent different preservation stages, suggesting refinement of technique over time. The oldest, cruder, shows stiff areas and discoloration. The newest could allegedly pass for living skin in candlelight. This progression indicates someone treating murder as research, each victim providing materials for experimentation. The journal Margaret of Trent discovered before burning it, those lists of names with "collected" beside them, suggests a cataloguing system of extraordinary scope. If the dozens, perhaps hundreds description is accurate, the killer had been operating far longer and more prolifically than official records indicate. This level of organization typically develops over years of activity. Serial killers who maintain detailed records show specific psychological traits, need for control, pride in accomplishment, and often plans for eventual revelation of their work. The burning of the journal represents one of history's great losses in criminal psychology. Margaret's decision, while understandable from a personal safety perspective, destroyed evidence that could have revealed the full scope of the killer's activities. A cryptic comment about things that should not be known suggests the journal contained more than just victim lists, possibly techniques, motivations, or future plans that were too disturbing for medieval comprehension. The 3-day gap between the Locksley murder and the Nottingham Gate appearance gained significance when analysed as a behavioural pattern. This represents the cooling-off period, the time between killings when serial killers process their experiences, relive their crimes, and plan future activities. But this killer used this time productively, creating or selecting a decoy head and planning an elaborate performance. This suggests someone who doesn't need extended cooling-off periods, who can transition quickly from killing to planning to performance. This rapid cycling is associated with accelerated killing patterns and suggests a metabolism for violence that far exceeds normal serial killer parameters. The specific details of the gate incident reveal layers of planning. Witnesses describe the stranger's clothing as fine but worn, suggesting either careful costume selection to appear as minor nobility fallen on hard times, or possibly clothing taken from a previous victim. The travelling cloak showed wear patterns consistent with long use, but the boots were notably new. This mixture of old and new, fine and worn created a specific impression. Someone with history, with stories. Someone interesting enough to remember, but not threatening enough to immediately detain. The stranger's knowledge of bureaucratic procedures proves particularly revealing. He knew exactly which guard captain had authority to validate bounty claims, understood the paperwork requirements, even knew the specific amount of the posted reward. This wasn't casual knowledge but studied intelligence, suggesting either inside sources or extensive surveillance of administrative procedures. The voice witnesses described, educated with traces of multiple regional accents, suggests either natural mimicry abilities or theatrical training. But more significantly, the killer could modulate his voice to project different social classes. The ability to speak as both nobleman and commoner, to switch between Latin legal terms and street vernacular, indicates someone who had moved extensively through different social strata. The selection of Geoffrey of Trent as the next victim reveals strategic thinking. As the guard captain who accepted the head, who should have been suspicious but wasn't, Geoffrey represented a specific type of failure the killer wanted to punish. But more than that, Geoffrey was positioned to investigate, to ask questions, to potentially uncover the deception. His elimination was preemptive, removing a threat before it could materialize. The locked room aspect of Geoffrey's murder has generated centuries of speculation, but modern analysis suggests several possibilities. The window, while small, could accommodate a person with exceptional flexibility or unusually slight build. The chimney, though seemingly too narrow, shows tool marks suggesting it may have been widened and then restored. The floor shows subtle signs of previously removed and replaced boards. Each possibility requires different skills, but all suggest someone who had studied the building's architecture extensively. The timing of Geoffrey's murder, the same night he began investigating the stranger, indicates the killer had information sources within the sheriff's organization. Someone reported Geoffrey's interest, his questions, his growing suspicions. This suggests a network of informants or collaborators, or alternatively, someone with such perfect surveillance of the sheriff's operations that they could respond to threats in real time. The partial report Geoffrey was writing provides a window into his final moments. The handwriting starts clear and becomes increasingly erratic. The killer didn't kill immediately, but engaged in extended interaction. He says he needs my face more than I do, suggests not just conversation but explanation, justification. The killer wanted Geoffrey to understand the logic of his death, the necessity of his contribution to the killer's collection. This need to be understood by victims represents a specific form of narcissistic personality structure. The killer saw himself as engaged in important work that required recognition, even if that recognition came from those about to die. He wasn't just taking faces, he was expecting his victims to appreciate the honor of contributing to his art. The systematic body dumps throughout Sherwood Forest represent perhaps the most damning evidence against the Robin Hood legend. These weren't hidden graves or hastily concealed victims. These were displays, exhibitions, advertisements for the killer's work. The consistency across dozens of sites over multiple years defies any explanation other than a single, controlling intelligence. The bramble clearings where bodies were found share characteristics that rule out coincidence. Each clearing was perfectly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with brambles that appeared to have been cultivated and trained to grow in specific patterns. Creating these spaces would have taken months, possibly years of careful cultivation. The brambles weren't simply cut back, but guided, shaped, formed into living walls that created secluded galleries for the display of death. This isn't crime scene selection, this is crime scene construction. The killer prepared his galleries in advance, knowing he would need them. The level of premeditation this represents exceeds anything in the serial killer literature. Most killers are opportunistic in their disposal methods, using whatever concealment is available. This killer was creating custom design spaces for specific purposes, showing a level of long-term planning that suggests exceptional executive function and impulse control. The positioning of bodies within these clearings followed rigid protocols. Every corpse was found facing north, arms crossed over the chest, with specific botanical elements arranged around them. The consistency is remarkable. Across dozens of crime scenes over multiple years, the same arrangement appears, with only minor variations. The northern orientation has both practical and symbolic significance. Practically, it ensured bodies were positioned relative to a fixed point, allowing for precise replication. Symbolically, north was associated with judgment, with the cold justice of winter, with the direction from which the harshest weather came. The killer was positioning his victims to face judgment, though whose judgment remains unclear. The botanical elements deserve detailed analysis. Robin feathers, always 13, always arranged in a perfect circle around the body. The number 13 carries occult significance in medieval numerology, but more importantly, it's specific. The killer counted every time, brought exactly 13 feathers to each scene. This kind of precision in the midst of murder requires extraordinary emotional control, and suggest the arrangement served a psychological need for the killer. The feathers themselves were always fresh, showing no signs of storage or age. This suggests the killer maintained live robins or had reliable access to fresh feathers. The logistics of this, capturing birds, maintaining them, harvesting feathers as needed, speaks to resources and planning beyond a simple outlaw's capabilities. Acorns appeared at cardinal points around the bodies, north, south, east and west. But not random acorns. The analysis of the specimens shows they were sorted by size, with the largest always placed to the north. The acorns were also treated with some form of preservative that prevented normal decay. Months after placement, they remained fresh, uncorrupted, as if frozen in time. Holly springs were woven into the hair of victims, or, when the scalp had been taken, pinned to clothing, where the head would rest. The holly was always flowering, a detail that provides temporal evidence, as holly flowers only during specific weeks. Bodies found with flowering holly were therefore killed during this narrow window, suggesting the killer timed certain murders to coincide with the availability of specific botanical elements. The post-mortem treatment of bodies reveals medical knowledge that shouldn't have existed in medieval England. Bodies found weeks after death showed minimal decomposition, despite the forest's humid environment that should have accelerated decay. Chemical analysis of tissue samples reveals traces of compounds consistent with advanced embalming techniques. The killer understood putrefaction at a biochemical level and had developed methods to arrest it. The preservation wasn't perfect, or intended to be permanent. Instead, it was calculated to maintain the bodies in a specific state of decay for a specific duration. The killer wanted his scenes discovered, but not too quickly. He wanted the bodies recognizable, but not fresh. This temporal control over discovery suggests someone who understood search patterns, patrol routes, and the habits of forest workers. The facial mutilations follow patterns that become clear only when multiple cases are compared. The cuts show tool marks consistent with specialized instruments, not common knives but surgical implements. The same tools were used across multiple victims, identifiable by microscopic striations in the cut marks. This represents another level of signature, not just the pattern of mutilation, but the specific instruments used to create it. The selectivity in what was taken versus what was left proves particularly revealing. Faces were always removed entirely. Ears were taken from some victims, but not others, with no apparent pattern, until genealogical analysis reveals that ears were taken only from victims with attached earlobes, a hereditary trait. The killer was selecting based on genetic characteristics, collecting variations like a naturalist collecting specimens. Fingers were removed following a complex pattern that seemed random to medieval observers. Modern analysis reveals the pattern. The killer was taking prints from fingers that showed unusual or distinctive ridge patterns. He had discovered, centuries before its forensic application, that fingerprints were unique identifiers, and he was collecting exceptional examples. The 2 arrow-like distance from camps represents mathematical precision that speaks to education. When Brother Francis mapped the dump sites, he discovered they formed a network of interconnected points, each exactly 400 yards from signs of habitation. But more than simple distance, the sites were positioned to create geometric patterns. Triangles, hexagons, complex polygons that only become visible when plotted on accurate maps. The killer wasn't just maintaining consistent distance, but creating mathematical art with his murder sites. This suggests someone with training in geometry, possibly architecture or military engineering. The level of mathematical sophistication required to create these patterns without modern surveying equipment indicates exceptional spatial intelligence and possibly access to advanced mathematical texts. Victim profiles, when analysed collectively, reveal targeting patterns that contradict the Robin Hood legend. The public narrative suggests Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor, but the bodies in the brambles tell a different story entirely. Victims included Thomas the Chandler, a candlemaker barely surviving on church commissions. Margaret of Westby, a young woman travelling to her wedding. Brother Francis of Rievaulx, a Cistercian monk who had taken vows of poverty. William Scarlett, age 14, a messenger on his first solo journey. Eleanor Fitzwalter, known for her charity work among lepers. Robert of Locksley, a guard who regularly shared his rations with street children. These weren't oppressors or wealthy merchants. These were ordinary people, many of them poor themselves, whose only crime was entering the wrong part of the forest at the wrong time. The killer wasn't selecting based on class or wealth, but on availability and opportunity. The elaborate crime scenes served multiple strategic purposes beyond the killer's psychological needs. They marked territory, establishing zones of control within Sherwood. Left, they created fear that kept people away from certain areas, reducing the chance of discovery of the killer's primary operations. Most cleverly, they misdirected investigation by being so bizarre that rational analysis became impossible. By making the scene so ritualistic, so seemingly occult, the killer ensured they'd be attributed to supernatural forces or pagan cults rather than a single human predator. This misdirection protected him for years as authorities searched for groups of devil worshippers rather than one intelligent psychopath. The escalation pattern across the dump sites shows learning and refinement that spans years. Early scenes were simpler: body, feathers, basic positioning. Middle period scenes added complexity, multiple bodies arranged in conversation, personal effects displayed like museum exhibits. Late period scenes became theatrical set pieces, bodies positioned to tell stories, props added to create narratives, even what appeared to be staged dialogues between corpses. The killer was developing as an artist, pushing boundaries, experimenting with his medium. The seasonal patterns in body discovery align with multiple factors. Spring and autumn showed the highest discovery rates, coinciding with increased forest traffic during trading seasons. But analysis reveals a deeper pattern. Bodies were specifically timed to be discovered during religious festivals. Easter week, Michaelmas, All Saints' Day, the killer was ensuring his work would be found when it would have maximum psychological impact on a religious population. Weather patterns were also exploited. Bodies were positioned to be protected from rain in some cases, exposed in others. The killer understood how weather would affect decomposition and discovery, using natural elements as timing mechanisms. A body placed in a hollow would be protected from scavengers, but exposed to moisture. A body on higher ground would mummify in dry conditions. Each placement was calculated for specific preservation and discovery timing. The Brother Francis maps reveal something extraordinary when subjected to mathematical analysis. The dump sites don't just form geometric patterns, they create a massive spiral centered on a specific area of Sherwood. This spiral follows mathematical principles that wouldn't be formally described until centuries later. The killer was creating a logarithmic spiral, a pattern found in nature but requiring advanced mathematics to construct deliberately. At the center of this spiral lies approximately 2 square miles of forest that remain curiously empty of bodies. This blank space represents the killer's safe zone. He never killed there, never left bodies there, never allowed his work to contaminate this space. This is likely where he lived, worked, and stored his trophies. The discipline required to maintain this separation for years speaks to extraordinary self-control and long-term thinking. Analysis of soil samples from dump sites reveals consistent non-heinous minerals, suggesting the killer tracked specific substances from his home base to crime scenes. These minerals, consistent with limestone cave systems, narrow the possible location of his primary residence. Sherwood contains several cave systems, but only one falls within the blank space at the center of the spiral. The corpse preparation shows evolution in technique that suggests systematic experimentation. Early bodies show hesitation marks, multiple attempts at certain cuts, imperfect preservation. Middle period bodies demonstrate growing confidence and skill. Late period bodies represent mastery, single clean cuts, perfect chemical preservation, artistic arrangement that transforms death into tableau. This progression shows someone approaching murder as a craft to be perfected. The evolution from individual victims to entire patrols represents a quantum leap in operational capability that demands careful analysis. The progression follows patterns consistent with serial killer development but accelerated beyond normal parameters. The early phase establishes baseline competence. Individual travelers killed with single arrows, bodies hidden with basic competence, minimal staging. These murders, spanning approximately 6 months, show someone learning their craft but not yet confident in their abilities. The arrow placement improves steadily. The first victim was shot 3 times before a fatal strike, The 10th victim died from a single perfectly placed shaft. The transition to pairs reveals growing confidence and tactical sophistication. Killing two armed men before either can raise an alarm requires split-second timing, predictive modeling of human behavior, and absolute accuracy. Analysis of these crime scenes shows the killer positioned himself at locations that provided optimal sight lines and escape routes. He studied how pairs of travelers moved together, identified moments when their attention would be divided, and struck with surgical precision. But it's the leap to eliminating entire patrols that reveals true operational genius. The fortnight of vanishing remains one of history's most puzzling criminal events. Over 14 days, 3 separate patrols totaling 30 armed men simply ceased to exist. The first patrol, 6 men led by veteran Sergeant Henry Thurleby, represented a formidable target. These weren't raw recruits, but experienced soldiers who had survived the Scottish Wars. Their disappearance defies conventional explanation. The crime scene analysis provides crucial details. The patrol's last meal was found laid out, undisturbed. 6 portions of bread and cheese, 6 cups of ale, a pot of porridge still warm over the fire. Whatever happened occurred instantly, simultaneously affecting all 6 men before any could react. The absence of struggle signs eliminates conventional ambush. No disturbed ground, no blood, no scattered equipment. The men simply vanished between one moment and the next. Modern analysis suggests several possibilities, all requiring capabilities that seem anachronistic for medieval England. The most likely scenario involves chemical incapacitation. Residue analysis from the ale cups shows traces of compounds consistent with concentrated poppy extract. The killer had drugged the patrol's provisions, waited for unconsciousness, then removed the bodies with mechanical efficiency. This speaks to pharmaceutical knowledge, patience, and the ability to move 6 unconscious or dead men without leaving traces. The second patrol, 12 men with crossbow support, knew they were walking into danger. They travelled in battle formation, maintained constant vigilance, and made camp in defensible positions. Their disappearance is even more puzzling. The camp was found in perfect order. Bedrolls laid out in regulation pattern. Weapons stacked according to protocol. The watch rotation chart still pinned to a tree, showing who should have been on duty. But no men. The single arrow in the camp's centre, driven so deep it required 3 men to extract it, carried a message through its mere presence. I was here among you, and you never knew. The psychological impact on subsequent patrols was devastating. Soldiers reported inability to sleep, constant false alarms, and breakdown of unit cohesion. The killer had weaponized fear itself, turning the forest into a psychological torture chamber where the threat of vanishing exceeded the fear of death. The third patrol, 15 men including a chaplain, simply never arrived at their destination. Their trail ended at a stream crossing, horses found days later without riders, equipment recovered from tree branches where it had been carefully hung. The men themselves were never found, joining the growing roster of the vanished. The selection of exactly 3 survivors from major attacks reveals strategic thinking that goes beyond mere psychological warfare. 3 witnesses create a specific dynamic, enough to corroborate each other's stories, preventing dismissal as fantasy, but few enough to seem potentially unreliable. The killer understood group psychology, witness dynamics, and how authorities would process conflicting testimonies. Survivor testimonies reveal consistent experiences that suggest standardized procedures. Arrows that herded rather than killed, creating movement patterns that separated groups. Laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, using forest acoustics to create omnipresent threat. The moment of realization, when survivors discovered they were alone, their companions vanished without sound or struggle. These weren't random experiences, but carefully crafted psychological operations. The tokens left with survivors, arrows, coins, oak sprigs, serve multiple purposes. They're physical anchors for trauma, ensuring memories remain vivid. They're calling cards, linking survivors to the killer's legend. Most insidiously, they're tracking devices, marked individuals the killer could identify if encountered again. Several survivors reported being approached weeks or months later by strangers who knew about their tokens, who asked detailed questions about their experiences, who seemed to be collecting data on the long-term effects of survival. The voice mimicry abilities reported by multiple survivors open disturbing possibilities. Creating convincing vocal impressions requires not just physical talent but extensive observation of the target voices. The killer had studied his victims' dead relatives, learned their speech patterns, their pet names, their private jokes. This level of intelligence gathering suggests either an extensive network of informants or surveillance capabilities that seem impossible for the era. One survivor, a merchant named Peter of Coventry, reported a particularly disturbing encounter. He heard his recently deceased daughter calling from the forest, using the nickname only she had used for him, mentioning a birthmark only family members knew about. The voice knew things that no living person outside the family could know. Either the killer had supernatural access to the memories of the dead, or more likely, he had been gathering intelligence on potential victims for years, building detailed files that included the most intimate family details. The escalation timeline defies normal serial killer patterns. Typically, killers show gradually decreasing intervals between murders as their compulsion intensifies. This killer showed the opposite, starting with frequent kills, then developing discipline, spacing murders for maximum strategic impact rather than personal gratification. This reverse pattern suggests exceptional self-control and the ability to subordinate personal desires to tactical objectives. The ambush locations reveal deep understanding of both terrain and psychology. Stream crossings where horses would slow and riders would focus on footing. Dense thickets where visibility dropped to mere feet. Clearings that seemed safe but were surrounded by perfect archer positions. Each location was chosen not just for tactical advantage but for psychological impact. Places where victims would feel most vulnerable, where the transition from safety to danger would be most jarring. The silence of the killings remains the most puzzling aspect. Making armed men vanish without sound seems impossible, yet multiple crime scenes confirm it happened repeatedly. Chemical analysis of recovered equipment shows residue consistent with aerosolized compounds. The killer may have developed a method of delivering airborne sedatives, centuries before such techniques were formally documented. This suggests either access to lost alchemical knowledge or independent development of pharmaceutical delivery systems. The mathematical precision in victim selection becomes clear when casualties are analyzed statistically. The killer never took entire patrols when it would trigger massive retaliation. He calculated exactly how many men could vanish before authorities would commit overwhelming resources to forest sweeps. He understood the bureaucratic tolerance for losses, the point at which isolated incidents would be treated as systematic warfare. This isn't just tactical thinking, it's strategic analysis of organizational psychology. The social dynamics within the outlaw band reveal classic cult structure, overlaid with something far more sinister. Analysis of captured member testimonies, financial records, and archaeological evidence paints a picture of systematic exploitation, psychological manipulation, and eventual elimination of followers. The financial structure went beyond simple banditry. While the public narrative emphasized robbing the rich to feed the poor, internal accounts reveal a complex economic system designed for resource extraction and control. The 10% tithe taken from all proceeds appears standard for military companies, but the segregation of certain goods raises questions. Gold and silver went into common funds, but specific items, jewelry with unusual stones, books, personal effects of victims, were reserved for Robin alone. These segregated items weren't valuable in conventional terms. A brass ring worth pennies might be preserved while gold coins were distributed. A dead merchant's journal would be carefully stored while his purse was given away. The killer was collecting items with personal rather than monetary value, building an archive of his victims' lives. The initiation rituals described by captured members follow patterns seen in destructive cults but with unique elements. New recruits underwent staged deaths and rebirths in forest groves, emerging with new names and identities. But unlike typical cult initiations, these involved handling objects later identified as human remains. Cups made from skulls, wine mixed with substances that chemical analysis suggests included human blood. The psychological impact was profound. Members reported feeling bound to the group through shared transgression. They had participated in rituals that made return to normal society impossible. The killer had made them complicit, willing or not, in his crimes. This created a trauma bonding stronger than any oath. The inner circle dynamics reveal layers of control. Those closest to Robin showed signs of complete psychological dependency. They spoke of him in terms typically reserved for religious figures, all-knowing, all-seeing, capable of impossible feats. But their testimonies also reveal fear that went beyond respect for a dangerous leader. They believed Robin could read thoughts, could know instantly if they considered betrayal, could reach them anywhere. This wasn't mere superstition, but the result of systematic psychological manipulation. The killer had demonstrated seemingly impossible knowledge, often enough that followers believed in his omniscience. In reality, he was likely using intelligence gathering, behavioral prediction, and careful observation to create an illusion of supernatural awareness. The disappearances within the band follow a chilling pattern. Members who questioned methods, showed independence, or demonstrated divided loyalties would be publicly honored with special missions. These missions were presented as privileges: solo raids on rich targets, secret negotiations with potential allies, diplomatic journeys to distant supporters. The chosen members would leave camp with great ceremony, blessed by Robin himself, equipped with the best weapons and supplies. They never returned. Personal effects of these honored members were later found in forest dump sites arranged around faceless corpses. The killer was eliminating potential threats while maintaining morale through misdirection. Other members believed their companions were on extended missions, building the legend in distant places, too important to return to daily camp life. The winter meat supplies represent perhaps the darkest chapter in this analysis. Multiple testimonies reference harsh winters when game was scarce but the band remained well fed. Members spoke of special provisions that Robin procured, meat that was distributed only after preparation in separate pots, seasoned heavily with herbs that masked flavors. When connected with the number of missing persons during these same winters, merchants who vanished, patrols that disappeared entirely, a grotesque possibility emerges. The killer had solved the problem of body disposal and food shortage simultaneously. The mathematical correlation is disturbing. Harsh winters showed increased disappearances and decreased body discoveries. The missing corpses from patrol eliminations were never found. The band's survival during starvation conditions defied normal logistics. The conclusion, while circumstantial, seems inescapable. The psychological control methods reveal sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Rewards were distributed randomly, creating a variable reinforcement schedule that behavioral psychology recognizes as the most addictive. Punishments were predictable but disguised as jokes, creating constant anxiety beneath surface merriment. Public humiliation alternated with private praise, keeping members off balance, desperate for approval while fearing rejection. The camp's physical layout reinforced psychological control. Robin's quarters at the center provided complete surveillance of all movement. The concentric circles of trust meant everyone could see their relative status, creating competition for proximity to the leader. Limited exit routes that could be easily monitored meant leaving required permission or extreme risk. Emergency supply caches were known only to Robin, creating resource dependency. This wasn't just a camp, but a physical manifestation of psychological control, architecture as oppression. The secret caches throughout the forest served multiple purposes beyond simple resource storage. Mapped locations show they formed a network allowing rapid movement and resupply, but they also contained items that defied explanation. Wrapped bundles that members were forbidden to examine. Preserved materials that chemical analysis suggests were organic in nature. Collections organized with the same obsessive precision seen at dump sites. These weren't just supply depots, but extensions of the killer's collecting behavior. The testimonies of escaped members, few as they were, reveal the true horror of life in the band. They spoke of tests of loyalty that grew progressively more extreme, starting with theft, progressing to assault, culminating in participation in murders. Members were made complicit in stages, each transgression making the next easier, each crime binding them tighter to the group. By the time they realized what they'd become, escape seemed impossible. Where could they go with blood on their hands? The killer's personal habits, gleaned from scattered observations, paint a picture of extreme narcissistic psychopathy. He maintained multiple personas even within the camp, being different things to different followers. To some, he was a father figure. To others, a revolutionary leader. To the inner circle, something closer to a god. This ability to fragment identity while maintaining control suggests a personality structure that viewed self as performance rather than fixed entity. Religious elements in camp life went beyond simple forest paganism. Robin conducted ceremonies that mixed Christian symbolism with older traditions, creating a syncretic belief system centered on himself. He positioned himself as interpreter of divine will, the chosen instrument of justice, the hand of fate itself. Members were taught that their crimes weren't sins, but sacraments, that murder in Robin's name was holy work. This religious framework provided psychological cover for increasingly extreme actions. The end came suddenly, but was clearly long planned. When the sheriff's final offensive threatened the camp, Robin gathered his followers for what he called a great transformation. Members were told they would disappear into legend, become immortal through story, transcend physical existence. The ceremony that followed, described fragmentarily by the sole survivor who escaped during the confusion, involved distributed wine that many members realized too late was poisoned. Those who refused were shot by archers positioned in trees, archers who themselves then drank the wine. The survivor described a scene of orchestrated mass death, Robin moving among the dying, collecting specific items from each: a lock of hair, a personal token, a final breath caught in a vial. Even in massacre, he was collecting, preserving, archiving. The final disappearance represents the ultimate act of narrative control. Analysis of the sheriff's raid on the empty camp reveals not panicked flight, but orchestrated dissolution, executed with military precision. You feed the animal, and you'll be slaughtered. The personal effects arranged in the clearing weren't abandoned belongings, but carefully curated artifacts. Each item was cleaned, positioned with geometric precision, and selected for maximum psychological impact. A bow here, a cap there, a belt, a drinking horn, one for each known member of Robin's band, except Robin himself. These weren't random possessions, but identity markers, items that would be recognized by friends and family. The killer was creating a memorial, a final tableau that would ensure the missing were remembered. But remembered how? As heroes who vanished into myth, not as victims of their leader's final solution. The single red arrow driven into the oak represents a signature of unprecedented boldness. Analysis of the shaft reveals it was crafted specifically for this purpose: harder wood than typical arrows, treated with preservatives, painted with a mixture that included human blood. The depth of penetration required either superhuman strength or mechanical assistance. Tool marks suggest the use of a specialized device, possibly a modified ballista, to achieve the necessary force. This wasn't a message, but a monument, designed to last centuries. The transformation into legend began immediately, and followed patterns suggesting advanced planning. Within days of the discovery, songs appeared in taverns across 3 counties. The lyrics, while varying in detail, contained consistent elements that shaped the narrative. Robin as champion of the poor, the merry men as willing followers, the disappearance as ascension rather than death. These songs didn't evolve organically, but appeared fully formed, as if composed in advance and distributed by design. The speed of legendary transformation defies normal folklore development. Typically, historical figures require generations to become mythologized. Robin Hood achieved this transformation in months. This suggests active narrative management. Someone, or several someones, actively shaped the story's development, suppressing darker elements while amplifying heroic ones. Documents from the period show mysterious benefactors funding minstrels who sang specific versions of the Robin Hood story. The tavern keepers reported strangers who would buy drinks for the house if the right songs were sung. Monasteries received donations with requests for masses for the brave men of Sherwood, with suggested homilies that emphasized charity and justice while avoiding questions about methods. The killer hadn't just planned his crimes, he'd planned his mythology. Evidence of long-term narrative planning appears in recovered documents. A manuscript found in Nottingham Cathedral's archives contains what appears to be draft versions of Robin Hood ballads, written in a hand that matches documents known to be from the outlaw period. These drafts show careful editing, violent scenes softened, victims transformed into oppressors, murders reframed as justified executions. The killer was writing his own legend, creating the heroic narrative that would replace historical truth. The systematic destruction of contradictory evidence followed the disappearance. Court records went missing. Coroners' rolls were damaged by mysterious fires. Witnesses who spoke of darker truths suffered accidents or simply vanished. Within a decade, primary sources that contradicted the heroic narrative became scarce. This wasn't natural documentary loss, but targeted elimination of inconvenient evidence. The few surviving contradictory accounts were preserved by accident or hidden by those who suspected their importance. Brother Francis's maps survived because they were misfiled with agricultural records. The Nottingham coroner's reports were preserved because a clerk, sensing their importance, created copies hidden in his personal effects. These fragments survived the systematic suppression, waiting centuries for analysis. Modern psychological profiling of the narrative transformation reveals sophisticated understanding of social memory. The killer knew that people prefer heroic narratives to horrific truths. He crafted a story that met psychological needs, a champion against oppression, a clever trickster who humiliated authority, a tragic figure who chose mythical disappearance over mundane capture. This narrative was so psychologically satisfying that it displaced historical truth within a generation. The question of what happened to Robin Hood himself remains history's great mystery. The man who spent years collecting faces, who could become anyone, who understood preservation techniques that could maintain organic material indefinitely, this man simply vanished. No body was ever found that could definitively be identified as his. This absence is itself significant. Serial killers who aren't caught typically die in ways that reveal their crimes. Suicide that includes confession, death that leads to discovery of trophies, illness that prevents concealment of evidence. Robin Hood's complete disappearance suggests either a death so carefully planned it left no traces, or, more disturbingly, a successful transformation into another identity. The cave system at the center of the dump site spiral was eventually discovered and explored. The main chamber showed signs of long habitation, carved sleeping alcoves, sophisticated ventilation, water collection systems. But it had been carefully cleaned. No personal effects, no trophies, no evidence of the killer's work. Only one item remained. A single, perfectly preserved human face, mounted on the wall like a mask, positioned to watch the entrance. Whose face? DNA analysis wasn't possible, but facial reconstruction suggested a man in his 30s with features that match no known missing persons from the period. Could this have been Robin Hood's original face, preserved before he began wearing others? A final trophy, the one face he no longer needed because he had so many others to choose from? Financial records from the decades following the disappearance show unusual patterns. A merchant in York who appeared shortly after Sherwood's abandonment, quickly becoming wealthy through seemingly prescient trade decisions. A physician in London whose surgical skills far exceeded contemporary training. A nobleman in France who emerged with perfect credentials but no traceable history before a certain date. Each showed behaviors consistent with someone adapting a new identity, initial social awkwardness followed by rapid integration, knowledge that seemed anachronistic, occasional slips suggesting familiarity with Nottingham dialect. Were these Robin Hood living multiple lives with his collected faces? Or merely coincidence, inflated by suspicious minds? The preservation of the Robin Hood legend required active maintenance. The analysis of ballad evolution shows periodic corrections, where darker elements that crept into folk tradition were suddenly replaced by heroic versions. New ballads would appear that redirected narrative focus, always emphasizing charity and justice while minimizing violence. Someone with resources and influence was managing the legend across centuries, ensuring it remained heroic rather than horrific. The psychological impact on medieval England was profound. The Sherwood murders created a climate of fear that authorities couldn't acknowledge without admitting their impotence. The heroic legend provided psychological relief. If Robin Hood was a hero, then the disappeared weren't victims but participants in something noble. The legend allowed society to process trauma without confronting its true source. Modern analysis reveals Robin Hood as perhaps history's most successful serial killer, not just in body count or duration of activity, but in achieving something no other killer has managed: transformation from predator to hero in cultural memory. He didn't just evade capture, he evaded history itself, replacing truth with legend so effectively that questioning the heroic narrative still provokes emotional resistance. The evidence presents a clear picture: a highly intelligent psychopath who operated for years with impunity. Someone who killed prolifically while building a mythology that would protect his memory. Someone who understood human psychology well enough to predict how his story would be told. Someone who won not just by avoiding capture, but by becoming beloved. This is the true horror of the Robin Hood story. Not that a serial killer operated in medieval England, history is full of such monsters, but that this particular monster understood narrative well enough to ensure he'd be remembered as a hero. He killed dozens, possibly hundreds. He built a cult that ended in mass murder. He turned Sherwood Forest into a hunting ground where humans were prey, and he convinced history to love him for it. The final assessment must confront an uncomfortable truth. Robin Hood represents not just a successful serial killer, but a template that others have followed. How many historical heroes, examined closely, might reveal similar patterns? How many legends serve to sanitize horror? How many monsters have we transformed into heroes because the alternative is too disturbing to contemplate? Sleep well, listeners, with the knowledge that sometimes the stories we tell children contain shadows of truths too dark for daylight. The next time someone speaks of Robin Hood, remember the bodies in the brambles, the faces in the collection, the vanished patrols, the empty camp with its memorial of belongings. Remember that history's greatest trick isn't making us forget monsters. It's making us love them. Good night, and pleasant dreams of heroes who might have been monsters, and monsters who definitely became heroes. The evidence speaks its truth to anyone willing to hear. Robin Hood was real. He was brilliant. He was prolific. And he won. Forever and always, he won. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.